Great. Welcome everybody to the state of the river on the cusp of a new century. As we all recognize that there is an elephant in the room, the American West is experiencing one of its driest periods in history. A mega drought that threatens health, agriculture, the entire way of life. The Colorado River, once a mighty force carving out the Grand Canyon, is now running at dangerously low levels. And it will have a dramatic effect on the 40 million people in 7 states and hundreds of thousands of farms and ranches that it provides water for. Water, and not having enough of it, has become a big problem in Lake Mead, the largest man-made reservoir in the nation's capacity-wise, has dropped visibly by unprecedented amounts in recent years. If Lake Powell recedes much further, one of the nation's largest reservoirs could be at risk of no longer generating hydropower for the region. Already, the Basin states are being forced to adapt to the effects of climate change. As you can tell from our program, our next 4 guests are here to address the elephant in the room, as they will be discussing the current state of the river. Our panelists are Mr. James Prairie, the Bureau of Reclamation Research and Modeling Group Chief for the Upper Colorado Basin, Mr. Chuck Cullom, the Executive Director of the Upper Colorado River Commission, Mr. Ted Cooke, the General Manager of Central Arizona Project, and Mr. David Palumbo, the Bureau of Reclamation Deputy Commissioner of Operations. Thank you, gentlemen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. This morning, I'd like to start off by having a review of the conditions we've been seeing in the basin in the last 23 years. And I'm going to be focusing on Lake Powell's and Mead as we walk through this. So I'm showing here is some information about the basin that you're all familiar with. From 1906 through 2020, the long-term average in the basin has been 16 million acre feet of natural flow. We've seen a maximum use in 2000 of 16.9 million acre feet. This is what we had been used to until the drought began. In 2000, the drought began, and from 2000 to 2020, we see a bit of a different picture. 13 million acre feet, 13.4 million acre feet is the average natural flow we've seen in this period. 15 million acre feet is the average use we've seen in this period. And what we've experienced is a 1.6 million acre foot deficit between those 2 periods, the long-term 1906 to 2020 and this more recent millennial drought. Cumulatively over this 23 years, we've seen a reduction between use and supply of about 33.6 million acre feet. And I'll show this morning how the reservoirs are reflecting the impact of that imbalance between supply and use. This figure provides a picture of combined storage of Lakes Powell and Lake Mead. You see at the top Lake Powell beginning to fill in the 1960s and Lake Mead at the bottom continuing through present day. What I'd like to point out is that back in 1999, the combined storage of Lake Powell and Mead was 92% of capacity, or 47.6 million acre feet. During the 5-year period after 1999, we had the precipitous 5 years that dropped the reservoirs by over 50%. The next 15 years, we saw year-to-year variability, but continue to see a drop. And during the recent last 3 years, we've had inflows of about 61, 37, and 63% of average, continuing to drop the reservoir, and now we've dropped again by half, and are right now at a capacity of 26%, or 13.1 million acre feet. This translates to a storage loss of about 35.4 million acre feet. So that's reflecting that difference between supply and demand we saw. So these reservoirs had served us for 23 years, but we're now pushing them to their limits. This figure is reflecting that similar view, but now looking at a focus of both Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And this is looking at December of 1999. So I'd like to start there, where Lake Powell was 88% of capacity and Lake Mead was 96% of capacity. And at this time, Reclamation was working to complete the Colorado River interim surplus criteria in anticipation of needing to further to adjust the operating criteria to be able to address possible spills at Lake Mead. So that's what we were thinking of as we walked into the 2000 drought, the beginning of the 2000 drought. This slide's providing some critical indicators we look at reflecting water supply in the Colorado River Basin. These figures all begin in 1980. At the top, we're looking at precipitation, followed by temperature, then natural flow, which is influenced by both temperature and precipitation, and then runoff efficiency, which is a measure of how much precipitation translates into natural flow. And what you note from these is the precipitation at the top is showing a downward trend, temperature is showing an upward trend, natural flow, taking that information of temperature and precipitation, is reflecting a downward trend, and then that runoff efficiency is also dropping down. And these are all trends that we're seeing and believing will continue in the future, and something we need to think about as we look at projections, which I'll show at the end of this. Here I'd just like to focus on, this is the inflow data we use when we're looking at the unregulated inflow into Lake Powell. And you'll see where I talked about that information from 1999 to present. You see this 5-year period in the beginning of this record where we dropped that half of the full reservoirs within 5 years. We then see that period of generally below the long-term or the 30-year average. That black line represents the 30-year average from 1991 to 2020, 9.6 million acre feet. We see we drop after that 5-year period, and now we're at the end where we're starting to experience a similar 5-year period, and really what's going to happen in the next few years will define whether we continue to drop. If we continue to drop, we don't have the operating criteria to address that and maintain these reservoirs. So the current conditions right now, Lake Powell is sitting at 24% full at 3527 feet, 37 feet above min power pool. Lake Mead is sitting at 28% full, at an elevation of 1,044 feet, and less than 100 feet from min power pool. Total system storage is 33%, 19 million acre feet as of Monday of this week. You've seen this figure many times recently, and I'll just reiterate where we are. We're basically sitting at that point. This figure is showing Glen Canyon Dam at a cross-section, and we're showing critical elevations. Full pull at 3,700 feet at the top. You're seeing the elevation we've been working to maintain, 3,525. This is a critical elevation that's 35 feet above min power pool, and we're sitting right about at that point right now. Min power pool has multiple important points for us. It is a point where once we go below that, we're not able to work with the 8 penstocks we have out of Lake Powell, and we're reliant just on what we call the river outlet works or the bypass tubes lower down. And an issue with that is as we move past the penstocks, we now don't have redundancies in structure and capacity to release as much as we could had we had the reservoir sitting at these higher levels. So that has been a level we've been working to maintain. This figure is kind of showing you a front section of the dam, and here you're seeing a line that represents that 3490. Again, we're 37 feet above that. Below that, you're seeing the intakes for the penstocks. Once we have air coming into those points, we no longer can be using those because we'll cause damage to the turbines, and we'll be reliant on the outlet works you're seeing on the left. Those represent the bypass tubes or the river outlet works. Once we hit an elevation of about 3426, we no longer can release 7 million acre feet out of Glen Canyon Dam because of constraints on the bypass tubes. We actually start to see that we will be releasing less only because of constraints of how much we can push through. Once we get to 3,400 feet, then we'll only be able to release 3.5 million acre feet from the dam because of constraints on those release works. Because of this, we really are working hard to try and maintain those penstocks elevations so that we can be able to release at both the penstocks and the river outlet works. Coming back to this figure, we're now looking at adding in a trace that I'll be speaking about. And this is looking at our longer-term projections 2 years out. We will a lot of times look at what we call the most probable, 50th percentile, the min probable, kind of the 10th percentile, and the most probable, which is a higher level, elevation level. But there's always a recognition that we could have flows that are coming in lower than that min probable. What I'm showing here is the 2002 trace. Should we experience that this year? That's the lowest trace we have in the last 30 years. And with that, we're seeing that we would drop to 17% of capacity by the end of the year. And this is an elevation that is plausible at this time. It's one that we want to consider. Because of this, we've been beginning to work on the supplemental EIS, a supplemental environmental impact statement, to work to have operations beyond how we've typically operated the reservoir and how our current guidance allows us. We're now looking at the cross-section of those reservoirs once more, and we see that we have dropped down to these lower levels. We're seeing that Lake Powell would decline to an elevation below 3490. One second. And that Lake Mead is within the third shortage tier at an elevation of 1,022. Here we're looking at our long-term projections, and this show that most probable in the dotted blue, in the green, the max probable in the dotted blue, and the min probable in the red. And then also highlighted in here is the 2002 trace I've been speaking about. And under this trace, we're seeing that we would drop below 3490 and approach 3426. Sorry, 3490, and then as early as the summer of 2023, and as low at elevation as 3425 by the spring of 2024. And these are elevations that we don't want to be seeing at Lake Powell. As we look at the next figure, we're looking at Lake Mead. And Lake Mead, we're seeing a decline under that 2002 trace. Again, the highlighted orange line in there, where we see elevations as low as 1021 by 2023 and 995 by 2024, approaching that lower level of 950 where we have min power pool also at Lake Mead. So these are the conditions that, given our current operations, we'd be approaching, and we're working diligently to try and develop a new set of operations that can weather us through a condition like the 2002 trace, which I'll just emphasize is a plausible trace given those trends we're seeing in the basin. We're seeing trends of that increasing temperature, impacting natural flow. Those are trends that aren't embedded in these most probable projections, that green line. That's why we're having more emphasis on looking at the lower traces, recognizing we are not placing or don't have the information yet to bring those directly into our projections, but look at these with a mindset that that is a plausible trace that could happen, and we need to be ready and prepared to operate under that. Thank you.
Good morning. I will go as fast as I can. So which button advances? The green one. Okay, I see the one with the big arrow on it. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, I will go as quickly as I can, as I said, and thank you, Jim, for that introduction. And I've did a pretty good job assuming what we would be hearing from you, so I don't have to repeat that. Because of the hydrological conditions in the Colorado River Basin and the expected poor hydrology continuing, in June, Reclamation Commissioner Camille Tootin announced that modeling indicated that the Colorado River Basin water users would need to reduce use by 2 to 4 million acre feet above the tier reductions that had already been identified under the 2007 guidelines and the drought contingency plan. And as Jim Prairie just told us, both Lake Powell and Lake Mead are already at or quickly approaching their identified critical elevations of about 3,500 in Lake Powell and about 1,000 in Lake Mead. I say about because there are various protection volume levels that have been looked at around those two. But Lake Powell is essentially already there, and Lake Mead is going there within the next year and a half or so with no further action. The lower basin has been in Tier 1 in 2022. That's 613,000 acre feet among the three lower basin states and Mexico, and will decline into Tier 2A in 2023. Likely to be in Tier 3 in 2024. And just to note, Tier 3 is the lowest defined tier level reduction in the existing agreements, but that doesn't mean the lakes are going to stop when they reach that level. It just means we have not defined what happens next after that. There have been many other actions, and they seem to come with greater frequency and urgency. During 2021 and 22, there's a 500-plus plan that was announced here at CRWUA a year ago, and we were successful with meeting that goal. It didn't look like it for much of the year in 2022, 500,000 acre feet of additional conservation in 2022, and then also some additional efforts to protect Lake Powell in early 2022. Reclamation has been encouraging voluntary reductions from the states and their water users for some period of time. That was accelerated with the June announcement that I mentioned. And recently, in October, issued an RFP for system conservation with funding from the Inflation Reduction Act that was recently approved by Congress. Reclamation is also considering its authorities to impose additional mandatory reductions. So even though the voluntary reductions above the tiers by the basin states have been pretty substantial, it's not enough. And the United States is considering, well, what will we do then? What are some mandatory actions that the United States may need to consider? So in light of that, Reclamation published in November a Federal Register notice that announced that they would be seeking a supplemental environmental impact statement process to reevaluate the 2007 guidelines. This is a big thing. It's a big step. But it's necessary to have one of the things that was missing this past summer when the states tried to put together a voluntary program of what exactly are the United States' authorities to take action on its own. This process will plug that gap and define what those authorities are. Specific items that will be reviewed in this SEIS would be annual releases from Glen Canyon Dam below 7 million acre feet per year. That's the lowest level that's specified in the current 2007 guidance. It has to be at least 7 million acre feet per year. So this would explore, well, if we need to go lower than that, what would be the consequences? And then also modifications to the tier elevation triggers and or tier reductions. So right now we have tier 0, 1, 2, and 3, and as I mentioned, 3 is as low as it's defined, but doesn't mean the lakes won't go lower than that. So those elevations may be changed. There may be additional tiers that are introduced. The reductions that have to be taken under various defined or as yet undefined tiers may need to be modified to get us closer to and ultimately to this 2 to 4 million acre foot reduction. There have been quite a few responses to Reclamation's RFP. So far, Reclamation is collating through those, and there's not a lot of news about the quantity either of responses or quantity of water that's been offered up, but we expect to hear some more about that soon. In connection with a recently announced agreement between the United States and parties in California for federal funding for the Salton Sea, which is an important thing that we need to deal with when we're talking about less flows in the Colorado River and less diversions in the Colorado River. A lot of the agricultural production in Southern California, the runoff goes into the Salton Sea, and as one gets reduced, the other gets reduced, and it just exacerbates that condition. But as part of that agreement, California is committed to identify up to 400,000 acre feet in system conservation over a 4-year period between 23 and 26. It's a big number for California. It still is a long way from the 2 to 4 that we collectively need, but it's a good step forward. It is unclear at this moment how far these proposed actions that I've mentioned will take us toward closing that gap and how much remaining action by the U.S. will also be required. So there's a great deal of uncertainty these actions will help to reduce that uncertainty, but for right now, it is a state of anxiety and uncertainty. And so why is that? As I mentioned, there's been an emphasis on voluntary conservation above the defined reductions that have to be taken under the drought contingency plan tiers, and water users across the basin are asked to volunteer. There's funding that is available, but for the most part, people are not doing it for the money. They're doing it because the system needs it. But there are questions that come up. How do I know that how much I'm able to give up if I don't know how much will be taken from me under potential mandatory action later? Will the amount that I'm considering as a water user to do actually do any good, or is it futile? I don't know what other people are doing, what's happening in aggregate. We don't know. Should we just take what we're able to get now while we can get it, because we don't know, maybe next year we will get less, or in some cases maybe none? Will conserved amounts, and this is a real issue, will the amounts that one water user conserves because of the priority system just be basically stocking the lake for a higher priority water user to divert in a future year? But even in the face of these uncertainties, folks are still stepping up and contributing voluntary reductions under the United States plan that I mentioned, and other plans. So both potential voluntary and potential mandatory actions are beset by considerations about contract priorities and the possibility of litigation. This is a lot of water that we need to reduce. The priority, I'll call it the bugaboo. It's a very important aspect of the law of the river is the priority system, but it is a major consideration, and in some ways a major impediment to making progress. In order to reach the overall reductions of 2 to 4 million acre feet above the tiers, which is already almost 1.4 million acre feet all by itself, I believe, and lots of folks I think agree with me, that all sectors, regardless of priorities, will need to reduce. But there's an expectation, at least as of this moment, that the priority system will be honored, and the reductions that need to be taken will begin with the higher priority or lower priority water users, even if they're reduced to nothing. And the higher priority water users will be impacted only after lower priority users have given all that they can give. Health and safety considerations related to municipal use versus food production and food security related to ag use is one of the big trade-offs that is being discussed right here. What is the relative value of those two things? And both, I don't like to call them sides because it makes it sound maybe more adversarial than I hope it is, but have valid points. The higher priority agricultural users believe that their date of use is an important thing that established their priority, and this is something that has been going on in some cases well over a century. It's a way of life. What's the use of having a high priority if it doesn't mean something when there's not enough to go around, et cetera, et cetera? Food security, national security has been brought into the equation because of, as many of us in the room know, that a lot of the, particularly winter vegetables, come for all of the United States and large parts of the world from this one area here in the lower Colorado River Basin on both sides of the river. From the municipal point of view, I think they have some valid points too, which is, well, vegetables are great, but we sure would like to have some water coming out of our tap. And not every municipal user that has Colorado River has something else to fall back on if Colorado River use is reduced or eliminated. And this is complicated, of course, by the large amount of lower priority water that has been pledged to tribes in water rights settlements. What happens there if water is then that has been granted to those tribes is reduced or taken away? I don't have the answers, I just have the questions right now. So, and I put this in bold for a reason, there's a real possibility of an effective dead pool or run-of-the-river operations in less than 2 years. You saw the charts that Dr. Prairie showed just a minute ago. We're basically at those levels now or over the next 2 years. Run-of-the-river means what comes in is all that's going to go out. We may not be able to get water past either of the two dams in the major reservoirs for certain parts of the year, which just further complicates this. Aside from who gets what comes out, it's not coming out it's not under our control any longer. This is on our doorstep. I believe that piecemeal or sequential priority reductions seems to be the most deleterious path to a dead pool, particularly in Lake Mead. So if we begin with the lowest priorities and reduce them possibly down to nothing, destroying that economy, destroying that particular sector of water use, and then say, well, that's not enough. Let's move to the next one. And the same thing happens. And the next one, and the same thing happens until we get to the highest priority, and they need to be reduced too. We can predict with accuracy what's going to happen and how much is needed and where it can come from, and that no single sector or even a combination of them is going to be enough. While the lakes are at the level that they're at now is an opportunity to take some action together with everyone to prevent getting to the absolute bottom that we can go and living on what Mother Nature ekes out to us. Stingy Mother Nature ekes out to us. Reclamation in the states and the tribes must reach a compromise approach quickly to reduce significantly the risk that in a way that can do the least harm and prevent complete draining of the reservoirs. So this is going to be our collective top priority in the next 6 months. This is about the time frame that the SEIS process is expected to take. And simultaneously, though, conservation, the less we have, the less ability we have to conserve. So we've all given so much anyway. So we have to also focus on other things that we have been focusing on: reuse, recovery, those places that have stored water or have other supplies, and most importantly, augmentation. This is expensive. It takes a lot of time. We needed to start yesterday. And as my colleague, Director Tom Bishotsky from ADWR has said in a recent meeting in Arizona, we need it yesterday, but we're not going to have it tomorrow. But if we give up or don't work diligently on those things, we're going to stay in this where we're at right now for a longer period of time. But my last bullet here is the most important thought I want to leave with you. Efficiency, reuse, recovery, and augmentation, those will take time and money. But eventually, if we are diligent about those, as we're conserving, we do these other things, we can work our way out of this situation even without improved hydrology. And there can be a renaissance in the Colorado River Basin where we will have the infrastructure that we have in place will have water in it. It just may not be Colorado River water. It will be supplies that have come in from somewhere else. That's the vision that drives me to keep working on these things, is that it's not a continual cycle down to nothing, that there's something else out there for us to work for it. And this bad news needs to energize us to go and make some good things happen. Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Chuck Cullom. I'm the Executive Director of the Upper Colorado River Commission. I want to offer a few observations at the outset and then go through my opinions and observations. First, I want to acknowledge Chairman Hart. He provided one of the most important things that we as human beings can acknowledge and share, which is the urgent need to be grateful for the gifts that we are blessed to receive. And he was generous enough to offer blessings and to all of us as we continue to embark on this difficult journey together. He also explicitly acknowledged the responsibility that we all share for stewardship of these gifts that we share together. The stewardship to keep them vibrant and resilient now, but more importantly, his passionate plea that we make sure these gifts are available for those not yet here. So, is it the big button? All right, the big button. Oh, the bigger button. All right. Upper Colorado River Commission is a unique interstate organization that facilitates the cooperation and collaboration of the 4 upper division states of Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. It also has the benefit of a federal chairperson, and Ann Castle was recently appointed by President Biden to serve in that role. The commission is a creation of the 1948 Colorado River, Upper Colorado River Compact, and we are entrusted to ensure that the upper division states comport and comply with the 22 Compact and the 48 Compact as those states manage and utilize Colorado River water. I have 4 state commissioners, Gene Shawcroft from Utah, Brandon Gephardt from Wyoming, Becky Mitchell, our vice chair from Colorado, and Esteban Lopez from New Mexico. So we've got a team that's focused on preserving and protecting the Colorado River resources of the Upper Basin. So I want to start with, I think, plain facts. We spend a bit of time in the model space, the model universe. We know these are facts because it says on the bottom, science facts. The real world of hydrology, we receive precipitation. We are a snow-dominated system that runs off into the stream systems collected and delivered to reservoirs and to uses across the western United States. Pat Mulroy, when she was at Southern Nevada, would say we are all connected by this river, even people in Southern California. I think she meant that in a positive way. But the system, for this system to work, there are taxes, there are losses in this system that have to be paid. They have to be paid out of the resources we have. Evaporation and transpiration and transmission losses are all part of the depletions. And those are thorny facts that we cannot escape. And they are embedded in the models. Sometimes they are not embedded in the accounting. So there are distinct differences between the Upper Basin and Lower Basin. I want to share those very briefly. Aaron, in his remarks, noted that we are connected by this river. We are divided at Lee Ferry, but we are together as a basin. One of the key things to understand about the Upper Basin is it is a highly distributed water management system. There are thousands and thousands of points of diversion in the Upper Basin. In the Lower Basin, on the main stem, there are probably 25 to 30 major points of diversion. The density of use is entirely different between the two basins. If you think about the scale of CAP Metropolitan, the All-American Canal, and the Gila Gravity Main, so the California side of Imperial Dam and the Arizona side of Imperial Dam, you are talking about almost 85% of the entire use in the Lower Basin states comes from 4 points of diversion. Not true in the Upper Basin. The role of the Secretary is very different between the Upper Basin and Lower Basin. The Secretary has a limited role versus broad discretion in the Lower Basin. Accounting for depletions is a very different exercise. We'll just jump past that. But facts do matter. And the availability of storage for deliveries is a significant difference between the way people operate their systems in the Upper Basin versus the Lower Basin. The availability of storage in those enormous reservoirs to provide certainty of annual water supply. In the lower basin, in January, when you order water, you're gonna get it, because Reclamation guarantees it. And they'll take it out of storage to drive it down to you. In the upper basin, when you plant your crops, you plan your year, and if it's a super dry August, the state engineer will come and politely communicate that you are out of priority and shut you down. The polite term is regulate off. Regulate your diversion off. So in 2021, about 500,000 acres in the upper basin were regulated off or impacted by the lack of flow in the main stem and tributaries of the Colorado River. The Ute Mountain Ute tribe suffered a 90% reduction in their allocation. They have 111 pivots, and they operated 10 of them. That's a difference between relying on storage and living within the supply in the stream next to you. Upper basin stuff, we're doing tons of stuff. I'm not gonna read over this, but if you were at the UCRC meeting yesterday for 3 hours, we're doing tons of things. We've talked about the 5-point plan. That was in response to the commissioner's request for additional actions. We are implementing those plans with significant support and partnership with Reclamation, and across the upper division states. We released a RFP for system conservation yesterday. The commission took significant action towards consideration of a demand management program. We are engaging in planning for drought response operating agreements, taking water from Flaming Gorge and driving it downstream to protect elevations in Lake Powell. We are implementing, again, in partnership with Reclamation, building new water management and monitoring infrastructure to improve our tool set in the upper basin. And as I indicated, we are continuing strict water management in the upper division states. There's a infographic that's available at the Colorado Water Conservation Board booth. It's available on the UCRC website. It gives you the facts of what we are experiencing and doing in the upper basin. One of the Trans Mountain diversions are impacted by shortage. San Juan Chavez suffering a 40% reduction in supply. The Central Utah project suffered a 75% reduction in their collection system, which means they had to make deliveries out of storage. We are as Becky Mitchell says, we are on the front lines of climate change and drought. And we're doing stuff. So, Ted talked about trying to avoid a run-of-river scenario. We talk about it in the abstract. This morning, I went out to see what a run-of-the-river scenario looks like today, this morning. The inflow into Lake Powell is 4,600 CFS. The outflow is more than twice that, 9,700 CFS. So we are relying on storage to make deliveries to Lake Mead. Lake Mead's inflow, collecting just a wee bit through the canyon, is 10,000 CFS. The outflow is about 10,000 CFS. So Mead is actually declining, even though the inflow is equaling outflow, because the evaporation has to come from storage. So if we didn't have any storage, what would happen? 4,600 CFS would come in, 4,600 CFS would go out. You might catch a wee bit through the canyon, so your releases are 5,000 CFS. That's all. I'm guessing that the diversions right now in the system are much, much greater than 5,000 CFS because we're releasing 10,000. So 50% of today's use would be curtailed today. That's the future that we face. So next steps, Ted had a very optimistic framework. I'll be a little different. Collective painful action is necessary now. We agree all states, sectors, and tribes must play a role. Hydrology will dictate more than policy, and the alternative to inaction is brutal and entirely obvious. I figured this out on the website this morning. And the time for strongly worded letters is past, because all we would do is arrange deck chairs on the Titanic, and as is my practice, I apologize for copyright violations. Thank you.
It's good to be with you all. Dave Palumbo, the Deputy Commissioner for Operations with the Bureau of Reclamation. My job on this panel is to react what we heard from Dr. Prairie, from General Manager Cooke, from Executive Director Cullom, and allow some time for questions. So I wanted to start with what we heard from Dr. Prairie, the phenomena that we're seeing. He described the reduction in precipitation, the increase in temperature, the reduction of natural flow, and the reduction in runoff efficiency. That is vitally important to focus on. What is happening as a result of climate change, as temperatures are increasing, our soil moisture in the fall before first freeze is reduced, and that affects runoff when it happens in the spring. Additionally, we saw the hydrologic cycle graphic from Chuck. In the springtime, those increased temperatures are increasing evaporation, transpiration, sublimation, and that precipitation that we saw come down doesn't make its way into the reservoir. So that runoff efficiency is critical to be aware of and, frankly, to be afraid of. In 2021, we had 90% of the snow water equivalent in the system for the last 30 years. We saw 29% of the average runoff. It was a little bit better in 2022. Again, roughly 90% snow water equivalent of the median, and we had 59% of runoff. This phenomena should get our attention and our focus. There's a term that's used, it's pretty wonky, technical term called stationarity. Essentially, the ability to rely on the long-term record of the past to sample from, use statistical tools to predict the future. Because of climate change, and there's been papers written that have declared that stationarity no longer exists. We cannot rely on the past long-term record to predict the future. And what I'd like to share with you today, I think that we need to take that concept of stationarity very seriously, and that it doesn't exist, not only from a technical perspective, but also a policy perspective. We can't rely on what we've done in the past to be adequate for the future. So we need new tools. You heard from Ted, you heard from Dr. Prairie about the supplemental environmental impact supplemental environmental impact statement that Reclamation is pursuing. That is in reaction to this concept of stationarity is dead for policy. We need to create new tools. While our 2007 interim guidelines and the 2019 DCPs and the 2017 Minute 323 were smartly and deftly and appropriately developed and implemented, they're no longer enough. So we need those additional tools through that we're going to develop through the the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement. Those tools will be important for the next 4 years. We're also in parallel developing a new environmental impact statement for post-2026, but we need to get through the next 4 years. So I just wanted to touch a little bit about the environmental impact statement, or the SEIS. We began this process with the notification in the Federal Register. We have a scoping period ongoing. That ends on the 20th of this month. And we need your comments. We need your input. We're going to take all of that very seriously in the development of new tools. The type of comments and information we would like from you all is, what hydrology should we be assuming for the next 4 years? What type of reductions of releases might we need to see out of Lake Powell? What are the impacts that you see to resources in the Grand Canyon for those reductions? What type of reductions are we going to need to see out of Lake Mead? How do we administer those reductions? How do we consider public health and safety? So again, I would encourage you to provide comments. And I'd also encourage the Basin states, the tribes, NGOs to come together and develop a consensus alternative that we can consider in our decision-making process and issuing a new record of decision this summer of how to manage the system. At the same time, that consensus alternative, we hope, is being developed, Reclamation is developing a federal alternative to be prepared if a consensus alternative doesn't come together, or if that consensus alternative proves not to be enough with hydrology that we may be seeing. I want to applaud both the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin. The Upper Basin in the 5-point plan that Chuck described is a great start. The System Conservation Pilot Program that they're pursuing will help deal with this new reality that we're seeing. In the Lower Basin, Ted talked about the System Conservation Program that Reclamation implemented through funding of the Inflation Reduction Act, which you'll hear more about this afternoon from Deputy Commissioner Brain. While Reclamation is providing that funding that we received from Congress, the $4 billion, it's really up to the states and water users to provide that system conservation water. We'll be making decisions on the proposals that came in from the states in the Lower Basin in the month of January, and hope to be seeing that elevation building water, that new wet water that we're seeking, start to have an effect in 2023. We're also going to be issuing a request for proposals for system efficiency water. System efficiency water is a little bit different than system conservation water. Essentially, system conservation water is we're providing funding to keep that water in the reservoir, in the system, in the river for a period of time on a yearly basis. System efficiency water is water that would be developed by projects, capital projects, on-the-ground activities that will help accrue new wet water, molecules of water to the system for the long term by virtue of that investment in a capital project, whether that be lining a canal, a re-regulating reservoir, turf removal, or a whole host of other activities that will benefit the system. That program will be released again in the first quarter of 2023. So with that, I'll just end by, again, encouraging people to think about this phenomena that we're seeing with increased temperatures and lower runoff conditions, even though precipitation may be decent. And think about this idea that not only is stationarity not something to rely on from a technical perspective, but also from a policy perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We do have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any, just come to the mic and ask your question. Go ahead.
Thanks so much to the panelists for showing up and speaking. My question relates to the focus of the panel and the CRWUA title overall for this year, A New Century for the Colorado River Compact. The compact imposes flow obligations at Lee Ferry. 75 million acre-feet has to flow through Lee Ferry every 10 years under one part of the compact, and a contribution also must be made at Lee Ferry toward Mexico's 1.5 million acre-feet annual treaty entitlement. What I want to ask is, what is going to happen in the coming years if it proves impossible to satisfy those flow obligations at Lee Ferry, despite our best efforts in the SEIS and associated conservation and reservoir operation measures? Thanks.
You don't have to touch anything there.
Ted, you want to go?
Yeah, I can go first, I guess, as a lower basin person who would be at the receiving end of a inability, as the question was phrased, to meet the minimum delivery requirements under the Colorado River Compact. We have many such difficulties, I think, that I've identified that we can't do under the existing hydrology. We just don't, in many cases, have enough water to do it. But there are different ways to react to that. One way of it is, sorry, we just can't do it, and see what happens with respect to lawsuits or things like that. That is not an acceptable outcome, I don't think. Another way that is proposed often is, well, what we have doesn't work, so we need to throw it out and replace that with something else. I disagree with that too. There's a lot of value that has been built over the last century in the Colorado River Compact and the rest of the law of the river that I'm not willing to just toss it out and start over. And what happens when we're trying to create whatever it is that will replace that? But the practice has become, well, we will agree temporarily to do something else. And that is, I think, is the path forward. Nobody has to give up anything permanently. Maybe realistically, those types of things like 75 million acre-feet in 10 years and those type of things we'll never see again. It's possible. But it doesn't mean that you have to say, well, let's just assume that that's the case and make a permanent revision to something. I think we can say, no, we don't expect to be able to do this particular thing over the near term. And so we can have an voluntary agreement by all parties to say, let's do something else instead, and we agree to that, and you avoid all of the chaos from either, well, we just can't do it, let's give up, or let's throw it out and start over.
So, thank you, Ted. Do you mind? Sorry. I really appreciate the opportunity for my lower basin counterparts to advise the interpretation of compliance for the upper basin pursuant to the 48 compact and the 22 compact. So thank you for that, Ted. I think Ted's larger point is the most appropriate, is we're going to fight about that. I just showed you guys 50% reduction. If the water's not there, then the compact compliance isn't really a relevant question. I think the question is, how can we work cooperatively to protect the system, and we will figure out what a new commitment for flow is. It's not as if the upper basin is depleting 7.5 million acre feet as promised. Depletions in the upper basin, including evaporation, are about 3.5 million acre feet. So asking, well, could you deliver 7.5? Not if it's not there. So I appreciate the question, but I think the more relevant point was made by Dave Palumbo about we need to find ways, and Ted, we need to find ways to navigate a new normal, and strict adherence to the plain language and some of the law of the river is going to dry up this system. I think I wrote it down. Dave said the death of stationarity with the context around potentially the policy framework that we are comfortable with. Mike Connor, who is now with the Corps of Engineers, said we need to embrace the gray to figure this out. So, thank you.
You know, I'll just add briefly that the law of the river, and obviously the compact is a foundational element of the law of the river, is organic. It is growing, and it needs to change. And at the risk of repeating what Chuck said, or going back to this idea of stationary is dead from a policy perspective, we collectively need to address the law of the river to adapt to what the future is telling us will be the new normal, as Chuck said. So I'm not worried that a particular element or article in the compact is not going to be able to be adhered to. We just need to create new tools and other opportunities to manage the system in a better way.
Thank you. One last question.
Historically, in the West, we as a culture have developed to conquer. We have reclamation. We were to develop the country. At what point, and I've asked this question before at these conferences, at what point does growth, whether it's population, whether it is economic, whether it is developmental type, you travel to the Phoenix area and there are thousands of new homes and condos being developed. And it's not just Phoenix. You can go to Denver, you can go anywhere in the West, Pacific Northwest. We aren't looking at the reason that why we need more water. And all of our development, whether it is on the county levels or state levels, grow, keep our economy flowing. At what point do we as a society, whether it be in the West, the United States, or worldwide, we cannot continue the growth? We need to start looking at what can we sustain in the future. So any ideas on how do we go about containing growth and looking at we need to live within our means? Thank you.
Just offer one observation, and I really appreciate the closing remarks from General Manager Cooke on the opportunity for a Colorado River renaissance. And I think embedded in that is the idea of using the technological gifts and creativity to support the economies that people choose to have. People move to Phoenix and Denver and my little valley in Utah for a million different reasons, and that we need to find ways to, and I think we have the tools to provide opportunities for all the economies to thrive, tribal economies, for rural and urban areas with these innovative, creative tools. So I'm a contrarian on pushing back on growth. Communities need to have space to make their own choices about what they want to look like and what they want to be. And I think it's far be it from us to tell them, no, it's just going to cost more from an infrastructure and development standpoint.
To follow on to Chuck's point, I think I agree with him with practically everything that he said. There are plenty of rules already, at least in Arizona, that I'm very familiar with about growth and what is required to build a new subdivision and a demonstration of adequate water supplies and things like that already. I do not believe the way to live within our means is to have a government step in and say, no more people can move here, if that's even possible to do. For the reasons that Chuck just mentioned. I believe the market will take care of that. It's a lagging thing, but the scarcity of water will increase the price and people will make a different choice. And that includes home builders, and that includes people that are moving from one state to another. There may be time for the market to settle. It doesn't just happen instantaneously like the stock market. But this is the type of society that we live in, is a free choice. And people have the opportunity to make a equal opportunity to make a good decision as a bad decision, and that includes moving to a particular spot that may or may not have water. So we're focusing now on not acquiring water for growth. We're focusing on sustaining the supply that we have and augmenting it to get back to where we have enjoyed in the past. So growth will continue to be part of the conversation, whether we like it or not. But governmental fiat is not the way to solve that problem, in my opinion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. A round of applause for our panelists. We will reconvene at 10:30.